Hello everybody and welcome back to part 3 of the Maryland Listing Disclosures Training. I'm Tim Brooks with the Brooks Group at Keller Williams and the Ultimate Selling Team. I'm really excited about this piece of training and let's get started. Now in this training session we are going to go over all of the addenda that are circumstantial, meaning you're not going to necessarily use them in every single transaction. You're only going to use each one if it applies to the current situation. For example, the HOA resale addendum. You're going to use that only if there's an HOA involved in the transaction. Or say federal lead-based paint, you're only going to use that if the property was built in 1978 or prior to 1978. Same thing with the state lead-based paint. Short sale addendum, you're only going to use that if the property is a short sale. And then finally, change of status is just thrown in there because you may need to use that from time to time to get a price adjustment or to adjust some sort of term in that contract. So that's why we have that in there also, because it's going to potentially be part of your listing package at some point in the future after you take the listing. A lot of times also, if it's a short sale, I may get the price changes signed in advance. So that's why that's in there. Anyway, let's get started with the HOA. Okay, the Homeowners Association Resale Addendum for Maryland. So this disclosure is going to be used in any property that you're going to list that the property belongs to an HOA. So this document, without us going through it, because it basically just lists out what all rights the buyer has if there's an HOA. It's important that this disclosure be included in everything, and most importantly, this notifies them that they have 5 days to review the HOA package that comes from the Homeowners Association. So the seller must order that package from the Homeowners Association, and usually there's a pretty hefty fee attached to it, anywhere from $80 to $200 usually. Usually it's on the side of more expensive side of about $200. Now it's important to have that document ready to go when the property is listed, because a buyer has 5 days to review that HOA, the documents, and withdraw from the contract without losing their deposit. So let's say you deliver the HOA documents and you're already halfway or 25 days into your contract. They can withdraw. They have 5 days to withdraw, and they don't have to even state a reason why. So it's important that you give them this disclosure and that you also deliver those HOA documents to them as soon as possible. So I actually had that happen to me. It was my first year in the business, and it was the morning of settlement, and the buyer walked from the contract. I had not given them the HOA documents, and there was nothing we could do about it. Try explaining that to your seller and why there's nothing they can do about it and they can't get the deposit. Pretty embarrassing. So anyway, just going through these pages, it goes through all the rights they have, everything you learned in your real estate class when you got your license about HOAs and the time frames and everything. But most importantly, it is the 5 days for them to review this is very important. So it's better to have it uploaded with these documents all at the same time when you're posting the listing on the MLS to get rid of that 5-day period. Okay, disclosure of information on lead-based paint. Now what you're going to do, we're not going to read this verbatim. There's not a whole lot to it actually, other than this must be included if the property was built prior to 1978. So up there, you're going to actually have the seller initial at the top there that the housing was constructed prior to 1978, or if they're not sure. Either way, they have to initial one or the other up there at the top. Usually, if the house was constructed prior to 1978. Now, as we go down to the seller/landlord's disclosure, it's important to know where they must initial here. This is probably one of the documents where the initials get screwed up the most, because they go in certain places and there's a lot of them. So if they know that there was a lead-based paint hazard, they're going to initial where it says A1. That is extremely rare. In fact, I've never run into that ever myself. So usually my clients are signing where it says A2. Seller / landlord has no knowledge of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Okay, so they're going to usually sign A2 unless there is knowledge of lead-based paint being present or a hazard. Then skipping down to B, seller's landlord has provided the purchaser or tenant with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. I usually have them initial there, for B1 and B2. Seller or landlord has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. And then finally, we're going to go down to, and that's it. You're going to have them initial there when just preparing this disclosure, and then the agent, the listing agent's going to go all the way down near the bottom where it says agent's acknowledgement, and the listing agent is going to initial in that box. And then remember to have your seller sign at the bottom, and the agent must sign this one as well. Now that's all you have to do when preparing this disclosure for upload in the MLS to give to the other side. Now if you're the buyer's agent, you're actually going to have your clients, when it's time to submit your offer, they're going to initial the buyer sections here, that the buyer received copies of all information. So buyer's acknowledgement C and D, they are going to initial. Buyer has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. And then under buyer E, they're going to either initial 1 or 2, that they received a 10-day opportunity or mutually agreed upon period to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint if they choose, or signing 2 there that they waived the opportunity to conduct the risk assessment or inspection. So that is the federal form. Moving along to the state lead form, Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program Disclosure. So this one here is, I'm going to read the top portion here. Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program Disclosure. Under the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, the Maryland Program, any leased residential dwelling constructed prior to 1950 is required to be registered with the Maryland Department of the Environment. Any leased residential dwelling constructed between 1950 and 1978 may be registered in the MDE at the election of the owner. And at this point here, the seller is going to disclose that the property was constructed prior to 1950, or if it was constructed between 1950 and 1978, they'll initial in the second boxes. So if constructed in 1978 or earlier, then they're going to initial that the property is or is not registered in the program. And then we're going to go on here to talk about the program a little bit, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. And if the property, on paragraph 3, if the property is registered under the Maryland the Maryland program is indicated above, the seller further discloses to buyer that an event as defined under the Maryland program, including but not limited to notice of the existence of lead-based paint hazards or notice of elevated blood levels from a tenant or state, local, or municipal health agency, and then the seller initials, has or has not occurred, which obligates seller to perform either the modified or full risk reduction treatment of the property as required under the Maryland program. If an event has occurred that obligates seller to perform either the modified or full risk reduction treatment of the property, the seller hereby discloses the scope of such treatment below, and then they'll put in whatever they did to the property. And then, if such event has occurred, the seller will or will not perform the required treatment prior to transfer of the title, and then the buyer's going to initial that the buyer's read and understands the above paragraphs, and then again, the seller's going to sign, and the agent will sign also. Okay, now we're going to get into the short sale addendum. Now, I don't want you to get this confused with the short sale listing agreement addendum that we already went through. This is actually the short sale addendum that is going to be uploaded into the MLS and become part of the contract when a buyer makes an offer they are also going to sign this and send it back with their offer. So it's the addendum that actually goes in the contract of sale, not the short sale addendum that goes in the listing agreement, even though you have this also signed at the time of taking the listing. So I hope that doesn't confuse you a little bit. So going through here, acknowledgement of short sale. So I'm going to read just a couple of these. They're pretty short and to the point. Acknowledgement of short sale. The purchase price in the contract is insufficient to satisfy all debts and obligations secured by liens on the property, as well as to pay broker's fees and other customary and necessary costs of the sale. Buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that seller's failure to keep existing mortgages free of default until settlement is not a default of the contract. Seller's ability to convey good and merchantable title under the deed and title paragraph of the contract is subject to obtaining releases on all liens and encumbrances, because third parties will be asked to approve a lien payoff that is less than or short of the amount actually owed. This proposed transaction is referred to as a short sale. Okay, now we get into the third party approval contingency, and this is important because this says that this whole contract is contingent upon a third party approving this, the third party being the bank or the bank's investors who hold this paper. So third party approval contingency. The contract is contingent upon seller's receipt of written approval of the contract by third parties, including but not limited to institutional lenders, mortgage insurers, bankruptcy trustees, federal, state, and local tax authorities and or private parties. No later than 5 days after the date of contract acceptance, seller shall submit the contract to the third parties, together with any additional documentation required by the third parties for review and approval. Third party modifications, paragraph 3. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the third parties may elect to request modification to the terms of the contract as a condition of approval of the sale. If a third party requests modifications to the contract, seller shall, no later than 3 days after the seller's receipt of the request, deliver a written notice of the requested modification to buyer. All modifications shall not be binding upon buyer or seller without their mutual written consent. Now that paragraph is important because it is common for a bank to come back and renegotiate the deal in some form. Usually they'll come back and ask for an increase in the price or something to that effect. And then once that happens, it's up to the buyer to then accept that counteroffer, basically, reject it, or make a counter of their own. So it is possible for the bank to come back and renegotiate the deal. Paragraph 4. Terms and conditions not specified in the contract. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the third parties may elect to request that seller agree to terms and conditions not specified in the contract as a condition of approval of the sale. If a third party requests that seller accept such terms and conditions, buyer and seller agree that seller may, at seller's sole option, accept such terms and conditions. 5. Failure to obtain third party approval. If within, usually I like to put in at least 90 days, if within 90 days or X number of days after contract acceptance, seller has not received third-party approval as provided in paragraph 2 of this addendum, or buyer and seller have not reached agreement as provided in paragraph 3 of this addendum, buyer or seller, upon written notice to the other party, may declare this contract null and void and of no further legal effect. In such event, the deposit shall be dispersed in accordance with the deposit paragraph of the contract. 6. Notice of disapproval. If seller receives written notice of disapproval from the contract from third parties, seller shall deliver a copy of the written notice of disapproval to the buyer, and the contract shall be deemed null and void and of no further legal force and effect. In such event, the deposit shall be dispersed in accordance with the deposit paragraph of the contract. Offers after contract acceptance. Buyer is hereby notified that seller may have the right to continue to market the property after the date of contract acceptance pursuant to a written agreement between seller and the listing broker, and seller may be required by a third party to present subsequent offers received by seller to the third party. This just means that the bank may want any additional offers to be presented to them as well. Credit, legal, and tax advice. Seller is hereby notified that a short sale may have credit, legal, and tax consequences. Seller is advised to seek advice from an attorney, certified public accountant, or other expert regarding the potential consequences of a short sale. And 9, time frames for inspections, appraisal, and financing contingencies. This is probably the most important paragraph in this disclosure, at least for you as the seller. So there are two choices here for each of these situations. One is going to be the date that the contract was ratified, or 2, the option, which is the most common option, is the date that the seller delivers evidence of a third-party approval to the buyer, or it's the day that the short sale got approved by the buyer, and then they generally have 30 days to close. So what they're really asking for here are A, time frames for inspections provided by in the contract. So as you know, the inspection, usually there's 10, 15, it depends, whatever you negotiate, days for them to do a home inspection and withdraw from the contract. Now it stinks to go 4 months, 5 months waiting for a short sale approval, finally get it, and then have them walk immediately for some home inspection item. Even if you replace them with a new buyer, the process starts all over again. So I actually do it from the date of contract acceptance. And that's been met with a little bit of controversy from some buyers, and some buyers' agents don't like that. But that's better than having to sell the same property 2 or 3 times after the buyers get cold feet or they get impatient. So if you do it from date of contract acceptance, and they've spent some money on that home inspection, they've got a little skin in the game, they're much less likely to walk away. If they're not willing to do that, chances are they might be unsure and they may want to walk anyway at some point. So B, time frame for appraisal contingency, if any, shall be measured from. Now, appraisal contingency, I think that that's okay to do that from the date of third-party approval, because most appraisals are only good for, say, 60 days, 90 days, something like that. So you don't want them having to do that twice. And then finally, time frame for financing contingency, also that I believe also should be from the date of third-party approval, because their mortgage approval is also only going to be good for 30 days, 60 days, and then the bank's going to want updated pay stubs and all that kind of stuff anyway. So the main one that I would recommend that you get from date of contract acceptance is the inspection. And then they have skin in the game and they're locked in at that point. And finally, we have the amendment to listing agreement, or change of status form. As you know from your real estate licensing course, all of our things that we do with the listing, such as putting it in the MLS, the price, how we advertise it, we need our client's approval in writing for each of those things. So this is actually the form that we're going to use for things such as an extension of the listing agreement. So if we're going to extend it, it's got to be in writing. If we're going to do a price change, that has to be in writing also. Or if there's some other change of the term or condition of the listing agreement, it will go on this form. So this is an amendment to the listing agreement itself. It's not a disclosure or something that gets uploaded in the MLS. This is just something for your file internally that's going to change that listing agreement. I included it in this particular instruction series just because if there is going to be a short sale, I like to get the price changes signed in advance while I'm taking the listing itself. I usually like to structure the price changes in an organized way, say every 2 weeks from a full market value, and then every 2 weeks I like to do a reduction, so I'll get those signed up front. Otherwise, you just use this form as needed as the listing period goes along, and then make sure, of course, that they sign it, you sign it, and they get a copy. So just to do a quick recap, we went over any addenda or disclosures that were circumstantial based on the very specific needs of that particular listing, such as HOA, LeadBased Paint, short sale, and then also, of course, we had the change of status form thrown in there if you needed to do a change to the listing agreement itself. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for part 3 of the Maryland listing disclosures, and I'm looking forward to Part 4, where we specifically go into the Montgomery County listing forms that are specific to that jurisdiction. Again, this is Tim Brooks with the Brooks Group at Keller Williams Realty and the Ultimate Selling Team. I look forward to seeing you in the next training session.